Hello, my friends. My name is Robert Morgan, or Caesar. Greetings to all my colleagues at the channel, both old and new. To avoid any misunderstanding, this channel is a radio station with many content creators. So, if you'd like to hear me again, go to the channel in the playlist under the name Robert Morgan. Welcome to The Meat Grinder. The iron frame of the steam engine was roaring like a wounded beast under my boots as the wind ripped through the dark London night, blinding me with coal soot, rain, and ash. I was hanging onto the soot-covered railing of a moving underground train car at 40 miles an hour, my knuckle joints white, my revolver drawn, praying my grip wouldn't fail over the lethal iron tracks below. Every violent vibration traveled straight through my boots and into my spine, making my teeth clench with every rotation of the wheels. There was no room for a mistake. One slip, one moment of weakness, and the darkness beneath us would swallow me before I could even scream. The train screamed around the curve, metal grinding against metal with a shriek that seemed almost human. I could barely breathe through the smoke. My eyes watered constantly, and every breath tasted of coal, rain, and something metallic that reminded me of blood. Right in front of me, crouching on the curve of the passenger car roof like an absolute ghost, was Holmes. He didn't look human in that pitch-black gloom. His heavy black coat was violently whipping around his gaunt frame like raven wings, his eyes glowing with an unhinged, predatory brilliance as he stared down at a sprawling pool of fresh, crimson blood running across the wet wood. For several seconds, I couldn't understand what I was looking at. The body seemed almost impossible. The train was moving. The roof was shaking. The rain was hammering down. And yet the dead man was lying there as if someone had deliberately placed him beneath the wheels of fate and simply walked away. Stretched out at his boots lay the ruined, crushed body of young Arthur Cadogan West, his skull split wide open, his eyes frozen in absolute terror, and a blood-soaked leather folder stuffed inside his coat containing missing submarine blueprints that could burn the entire British Empire to ashes. His expression was the part one couldn't stop looking at. There was something about those eyes. They weren't simply lifeless. They looked as though he'd seen something immediately before death that had frightened him more than death itself. I shouted over the deafening scream of the iron wheels on the rails, asking him how a man dies on top of a moving train without leaving a single drop of blood in the station below. My voice disappeared into the wind almost as soon as it left my mouth. Holmes didn't even turn his head. He just reached down into the dead man's pocket with a gloved hand, pulled out a thick wad of cash, a golden pocket watch, and a complete lack of a train ticket, then looked up into the suffocating fog with a bitter, terrifying smirk. That expression chilled me more than the wind. Holmes had seen something that made the dead body almost irrelevant. He leaned down toward my ear, the cold wind carrying his razor-sharp rasp as he whispered that the dead boy never bought a ticket because he was already a corpse before the train ever left the platform. I stared at him. For one brief second, neither of us spoke. The train thundered beneath us. The fog swallowed the tracks ahead, and somewhere beyond that wall of darkness, I suddenly had the horrible sensation that someone was watching us. Not from the station, not from another carriage, from somewhere above. I slowly lifted my eyes toward the rooftops disappearing into the fog, but there was nothing there except rain, chimney smoke, and darkness. Then Holmes's hand suddenly tightened around my sleeve. I turned. His eyes were no longer amused. They were fixed on something behind me. That was the exact second a gunshot cut through the roaring engine smoke, the heavy lead bullet shattering the iron lantern right beside my head and showering my face in burning oil and hot glass. I dropped instinctively. Holmes vanished into the smoke. And for the first time that night, I understood that the corpse wasn't the most dangerous thing on the train. Someone was still alive. and they had been waiting for us. For days before we were ducking bullets on the roof of a moving train, London was drowning under pea soup fog the city had seen in 50 years. You couldn't see your own hand 2 inches, and the streets smelled like sour coal ash, wet horses, and copper. The fog pressed against the windows of our Baker Street flat like something alive, turning every distant carriage sound into a muffled groan. I was sitting inside our Baker Street flat trying to bandage a raw scrape on my shoulder when the heavy oak door was kicked off its hinges. Mycroft Holmes burst through the fog-drenched doorway looking like a panicked ghost, his massive frame soaked in sweat and his face white as a sheet. Mycroft never leaves his private club, so seeing him breathing hard in our sitting room meant the country was 20 minutes away from total annihilation. I remember staring at him without saying anything. There was something deeply wrong with the sight of Mycroft Holmes afraid. He was usually the calmest man in any room. Even when governments collapsed and politicians lied through their teeth, Mycroft remained seated, as if the entire world could burn around him and he would simply continue eating his dinner. But now his hands were trembling, only slightly, almost invisibly. Yet I noticed. His fingers tightened against the edge of the dossier, then loosened again. Tightened, loosened. It was the smallest movement, but it made the room feel smaller. The silence between us seemed to stretch unnaturally, as though something outside was listening for the next word. A carriage passed. The wheels groaned over the wet stones, then stopped. I waited for them to start again. They didn't. Mycroft looked toward the window, and I realized his breathing had become shallow. That was when a thought entered my mind that I didn't want to entertain. What if he hadn't come here because of the stolen plans? What if he'd come because he was afraid to be somewhere else? He didn't waste time on greetings. He tossed a classified War Office dossier onto the table, spilling dark ink across our papers. 10 top-secret blueprints for the Bruce Partington submarine, the most lethal underwater war weapon ever built, had been stolen from the Royal Navy arsenal at Woolwich hours ago. The head clerk, Cadogan West, was missing, and 3 of those 10 master plans were still loose in the wind, heading straight toward foreign spies looking to sell them to the highest bidder. I felt the room become colder. Outside, somewhere inside the fog, a carriage rolled past. Then another. Then silence. The silence felt wrong, not peaceful. Waiting. I found myself listening for footsteps that never came, wondering whether someone was standing outside our door with an ear pressed against the wood. Holmes didn't say a word. He was standing in the shadowy corner of the room, staring at the floorboards, scraping a rusty pocket knife under his fingernails with a terrifying, rhythmic clicking sound. Click, scrape, click, scrape. The sound became impossible to ignore. I watched the blade move beneath his fingernail and became aware of how sharp it looked. Mycroft swore that if those 3 missing pages crossed the English Channel before sunrise, the Navy would be completely defenseless. Holmes finally looked up, his gray eyes dead and unreadable, and told his brother to stop whining like a helpless politician because the boy was already dead. The plans were already compromised, and the real killer was currently sitting in a room less than 2 miles away, laughing at the entire police force. I felt a chill crawl slowly across my shoulders. Already dead? Holmes didn't answer. The words seemed to remain hanging in the room between us. I looked at Mycroft. For the first time, he didn't look angry. He looked like a man who had just heard confirmation of something he had secretly feared. He swallowed hard. Holmes simply looked toward the window. The fog had become so thick that even the gas lamps outside were reduced to faint yellow stains. For a moment, I thought I saw a human shape standing beyond the glass. Tall, motionless, watching. I blinked. It was gone. My heart was beating harder now, but I told myself it was nothing. A trick of the fog, a shadow, a passing figure. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure hadn't been outside the window at all. It had been standing exactly where someone would stand if they wanted to make sure I saw them. Holmes noticed my expression. He didn't ask what I'd seen. That frightened me more than if he had. He closed the knife with a soft metallic snap and placed it on the table. The sound seemed unnaturally loud. Then he said something that stayed with me long after we left Baker Street. The murderer wasn't hiding from the police. He was hiding from us. And if Holmes was right, the man already knew we were coming. Within 40 minutes, we were standing down in the damp, rat-infested tunnels of the Aldgate Underground Station, surrounding the broken body of Arthur Cadogan West. The scene was a bloody nightmare. The boy's body had been found jammed right against the iron rails, his skull shattered into pieces from a massive impact, his expensive suit covered in grease, coal dust, and thick crimson smears. The tunnels seemed to breathe around us. Water dripped steadily from the brick ceiling. Somewhere in the darkness, rats moved through piles of coal grit. Every few seconds the tunnel shook as another train passed, and the lantern flames trembled violently inside their glass cages. Each vibration made the rails hum beneath our boots, and for a brief second I kept expecting something to emerge from the darkness between the tracks. I couldn't explain why. There was nothing there, nothing I could see. Scotland Yard inspectors were running around like headless chickens, shouting orders, shining lanterns against the dripping brick walls, and calling it a simple robbery gone wrong. Their voices echoed strangely through the tunnel, sometimes sounding close enough to touch, and then suddenly distant. The deeper the echoes traveled, the less human they seemed, until the tunnel itself appeared to be whispering back at us. I knelt down beside the kid to check his pulse, but his neck was completely snapped, his jaw broken, and his pockets picked clean of every scrap of paper except for 7 top-secret government blueprints. I stared at the body longer than I should have. Something about the boy's face bothered me. His eyes were still open, wide, fixed, terrified. It didn't look like the expression of someone surprised by an attacker. It looked like the expression of someone who had realized, too late, that there was absolutely nowhere to run. For one awful second, I had the irrational feeling that those dead eyes were looking past me, towards something standing farther down the tunnel. I turned my head. Nothing. Only darkness. When I looked back at Arthur, his expression seemed even more frightened than before. That was when Holmes stepped out of the shadows, his heavy boots crunching on the coal grit. He didn't look at the face. He went straight for the shoes. He pulled a magnifying glass from his coat pocket, scraped a sample of the black gunk off the dead boy's leather soles, and held it right up to his nose. He sniffed it, rubbed it between his fingers, and then let out a low, mocking laugh that made the Scotland Yard detectives freeze in their tracks. That laugh echoed through the tunnel. For a moment, nobody moved. Even the rats seemed to disappear. The sudden silence was worse than the noise. It felt as though the entire tunnel had stopped breathing to listen to Holmes. Holmes pointed out what those idiot cops had completely missed. There wasn't enough blood on the ground around the corpse to fill a teacup. If a man gets his skull smashed open on iron tracks, the ground becomes a lake of red, but here the gravel was bone dry. On top of that, the boy's coat was soaked in grease, but his trousers were clean, his hands were unmarked by defensive wounds, and he didn't have a train ticket in his pockets. Holmes looked at the lead inspector, pulled a bloody splinter of cedar wood out of the dead boy's collar, and told him the kid was murdered somewhere else entirely, carried through the fog like a sack of grain, and dumped into this dark tunnel like cheap garbage. The inspector swallowed hard. I looked down the tunnel. The darkness seemed to stretch forever. There were no windows, no exits nearby, only the tracks disappearing into blackness. For a second, I imagined being dragged through that darkness while unconscious, never knowing where I was going, never seeing the person carrying me. Then I imagined opening my eyes halfway through it, hearing footsteps behind me, knowing I was awake but being unable to move. The thought made my stomach tighten. I forced myself to look away. Then Holmes whispered that whoever had done it had known exactly when the trains would pass. I looked at him. How could anyone know that? Holmes gave me a thin smile. Because he was here before the body was. That answer stayed in my mind. Someone had stood in this tunnel. Someone had waited. Someone had watched the train approach. And someone had known exactly where the corpse would fall. The tunnel suddenly felt much smaller. And standing there in that damp darkness, surrounded by the smell of coal, blood, and wet brick, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had waited for that train might still be somewhere nearby, watching us from the darkness. We dragged the chief inspector deeper into the pitch-black tunnels, trailing the smell of wet soot and old rust as steam engines roared past us every 10 minutes, shaking the iron beams above our heads. Holmes was moving like a hunting hound, staying low to the gravel, his lantern casting long, demonic shadows against the curved brick walls. I kept my hand clamped firmly on the wooden grip of my Webley revolver inside my coat pocket, listening to every strange echo bouncing off the damp stone. Every sound made me turn. A dripping pipe, a distant metallic clang, the scrape of a rat somewhere behind us. At one point I heard footsteps. I stopped. Holmes stopped too. We listened. Nothing. The sound had vanished. I told myself it had been the echo of our own boots, but the explanation didn't feel right. I looked back toward the darkness we just crossed. The lantern light barely reached 10 feet. Beyond that was absolute black. The longer I stared, the more certain I became that something was standing just outside the light. I blinked. Nothing. Holmes stopped right near a massive air vent that cut through the street level 50 feet above the tracks. He knelt down near a rusty iron junction box, scraping his fingers across the metal edge. He pulled up his hand. His fingers were covered in fresh, sticky red slime that hadn't dried yet. My stomach tightened. Fresh blood. Down here. Now. I looked at Holmes. He didn't look surprised. That disturbed me more than the blood itself. Holmes held his lantern up to the ceiling of the tunnel, pointing out a series of deep, fresh gouges in the iron girders directly beneath the street grid. Someone had leaned a heavy weight over the edge of the iron ventilation shaft above, lowering a lifeless body directly onto the wooden roof of a passenger car while the train was stopped at a signal light in the dark. As soon as the train hit the tight curve entering the Allgate tunnel, the sudden jerk of the carriage threw the dead boy off the roof, sending him crashing onto the tracks below. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach as the sheer simplicity of the trap hit me. There was nothing complicated about it. That was what made it frightening. The killer hadn't needed an army. He hadn't needed explosives. He hadn't needed to fight anyone. He had simply understood the machinery of London and used it like a weapon. The killer never stepped foot into the subway station, never bought a ticket, and never left a single footprint on the platform. Holmes wiped the blood off his glove with a white handkerchief, turned to me with a dark, hollow look in his eyes, and whispered that we weren't hunting a common thief or a greedy clerk. We were hunting an absolute genius who knew every train schedule, every dark alley, and every blind spot in London. I looked upward toward the ventilation shaft. 50 feet above us was the street. People were walking. Carriages were passing. London was alive. And nobody up there had any idea that a dead man had just been used as a piece in someone's carefully constructed game. I suddenly became aware of how completely trapped we were. If someone wanted to attack us down here, there would be nowhere to go. The tracks blocked one direction. The tunnel walls blocked the other. And the trains themselves could arrive without warning. Holmes stared into the darkness. Then he said something that made my blood run colder. A man capable of planning this far ahead would also know how we would investigate it, which meant every step we took might already be part of his plan. For the first time, I wondered whether we were actually following the killer, or whether the killer was quietly leading us exactly where he wanted us to go. Then somewhere behind us came a soft metallic sound. Click. Holmes turned his head. I tightened my grip on the revolver. Nothing moved, but neither of us continued walking for several seconds. The tunnel remained silent. Waiting. I rushed over to the desk, pressing 2 fingers hard against Sir James's neck, but his skin was cold as ice and his pulse was long gone. Rigor mortis was already setting into his jaw, his fingers locked around a crumpled sheet of paper on his desk. Holmes didn't panic. He didn't even catch his breath. He stepped around the desk, grabbed the dead man's wrist, and unclasped the iron fingers one by one until the paper fell free onto the blotter. It was a handwritten confession, smeared with ink and tears, but it wasn't a confession of treason. Sir James's younger brother, Colonel Valentine Walter, a degenerate gambler drowned in massive gambling debts, had stolen the vault keys from Sir James's coat pocket while the old man was sleeping, copied them in brass, and sold the access codes to an international spy ring operating out of London. Sir James had discovered the theft hours ago, and instead of facing the utter shame of seeing his family name dragged through the mud, the old man swallowed a fatal dose of poison and sat down to die in his own study. I read the confession twice. Something about the final lines disturbed me. A man who had spent 40 years protecting his country had chosen death rather than disgrace. The room suddenly felt less like a study and more like a tomb. I looked at the dead official again. His eyes were still open. I couldn't help wondering whether he had watched the door during his final moments, waiting for someone who never came. The silence seemed to press against my ears. I could hear my own breathing becoming louder, uneven and shallow, while the faint smell of poison seemed to linger in the air. I knew it was probably impossible, but standing beside that corpse, I had the horrible sensation that the room had not yet finished with him. Holmes tossed the letter aside like worthless trash, his face cold and unfeeling. He didn't care about the dead official's honor or his brother's pathetic debts. He cared about the 3 missing blueprint pages that hadn't been found on Cadogan West's corpse. Holmes began tearing the study apart, pulling out desk drawers, ripping open filing cabinets, and throwing heavy books onto the carpet. Every drawer he opened seemed to make the room more chaotic. Every document he discarded increased my uneasiness. It was as though we were destroying the final traces of a man who had died terrified of something nobody else understood. The clock on the wall continued ticking. Slowly, patiently. The sound seemed almost disrespectful in the presence of the corpse. With every tick, I became more conscious of the darkness beyond the open doorway. I kept expecting to see a face there, just for a fraction of a second, before disappearing again. I told myself it was imagination, yet I couldn't stop looking. Holmes reached the heavy iron safe in the wall, pulled out a small stethoscope, pressed it against the cold steel door, and spun the dial with blinding speed until the tumblers clicked open. Inside the safe lay a stack of foreign telegrams, encrypted coded messages, and a freshly printed train ticket to Paris dated for midnight tonight. Holmes picked up the ticket, turned to me with a wicked, razor-sharp smile, and said the killer was about to make his final escape, but we were going to make sure he caught a very different train. I stared at the ticket. Midnight. Only a few hours away. For some reason, the room suddenly felt colder. The killer wasn't somewhere distant. He was moving, planning, counting the minutes. Holmes folded the ticket and placed it inside his coat. Then the floorboard behind us creaked. We both turned. Nothing. The door was still open. The hallway beyond it was black. I stared into that darkness, unable to convince myself that it was empty. For several seconds, I could barely breathe. The hallway looked impossibly deep, as if the darkness had weight, as if something could be standing just beyond the reach of the lamplight without making a sound. Holmes quietly raised his revolver. Neither of us spoke. The dead official remained seated behind the desk, his lifeless eyes fixed toward the doorway. And for one horrible moment, I had the irrational feeling that Sir James was still waiting for someone to enter that room. Someone who already knew we were there. Someone who might have been standing outside that door the entire time, listening to every word we had spoken. Following the trail of encrypted telegrams found in the dead official's safe, Holmes and I navigated through a labyrinth of narrow, foul-smelling alleys near Caulfield Gardens. The fog here was so thick it felt like swallowing wet wool, muffling our footsteps as we crept down the iron fire escape toward a ground floor apartment that backed directly up against the elevated underground railway tracks. The fog seemed to absorb everything around us. Even our breathing sounded distant. I kept glancing over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that our footsteps weren't the only ones moving through the fog. Whenever I stopped, the silence behind us seemed to stop with me. I told myself it was only nerves, but the longer we stood there, the more convinced I became that something was watching from somewhere beyond the pale wall of mist. The rear window of Oberstein's flat sat less than 4 feet above the iron girders where the train slowed down to take the sharp turn toward Aldgate. Holmes pulled out his pocket knife and jimmied the window sash, sliding into the dark kitchen silently, his revolver drawn and ready. I climbed in right behind him, stepping over broken glass and scattered papers. The apartment smelled of cheap gin, burnt gunpowder, and stale tea. The place had been turned upside down in a hurry, drawers pulled out, clothes tossed across the floor, and open trunks sitting empty in the hallway. Oberstein was packing up to flee the country, but he had left behind something vital. I stood in the kitchen doorway and listened. Nothing. That silence bothered me. A man like Oberstein should have left noise behind him, some obvious sign of panic, some hurried mistake. Instead, the apartment felt strangely deliberate, as though someone had emptied it while knowing exactly what he could afford to leave behind. For a moment, I became painfully aware of every tiny sound inside the flat, the faint ticking of a clock, the creak of old wood beneath my boots, even the soft movement of my own clothes when I breathed. The apartment seemed to be waiting for us to make the first mistake. Holmes dropped to his knees in front of the windowsill, running his gloved fingers across the heavy velvet curtains hanging over the iron frame. He pulled the fabric back, showing me a bright, wet smear of fresh blood right at waist height on the windowsill, along with heavy grease marks matching the dead clerk's coat. My stomach tightened. This was the exact spot where Cadogan West had been murdered. The kid had tracked the traitorous Colonel Valentine Walter to this very apartment, caught him handing over the stolen blueprints to Oberstein, and tried to fight his way out. Oberstein had struck the boy from behind with an iron rod, stolen the 3 crucial blueprint pages, and then used the window to drop the corpse onto the roof of the train stopped below. I stared at the blood. For a moment, I could almost imagine the struggle that had happened here. A hand grabbing the curtain, a body stumbling backward, a desperate attempt to reach the window, then silence. The image became so vivid in my mind that I almost expected to hear the boy's final breath somewhere behind me. Holmes remained completely focused on the evidence. I looked deeper into the apartment. The hallway disappeared into darkness. There were several doors, all of them closed. I suddenly wondered whether Oberstein had left someone behind. I knew it was irrational, but fear had begun turning every ordinary object into a threat. A coat hanging from a hook looked like a man standing motionless. A dark doorway looked like an open mouth. Even the curtains seemed to move despite the absence of wind. Then the underground railway thundered past the apartment. The walls shook. The windows rattled violently. For 1 second, the room was filled with a metallic scream. When the noise faded, the silence returned even heavier than before. Holmes slowly looked toward the hallway. He had heard something too. Neither of us moved. Then he quietly whispered that Oberstein had left in a hurry. But I couldn't stop thinking about one thing. If he had been in such a hurry, why had he left the evidence behind? The answer sat like a cold stone inside my chest. Perhaps he hadn't left it by accident. Perhaps he wanted someone to find it. We didn't call Scotland Yard. We didn't call the local police. Calling the cops meant bureaucracy, delays, and giving Oberstein the extra hour he needed to reach the docks and slip onto a ship heading for the continent. Holmes locked the rear window, pulled 2 heavy wooden chairs into the pitch-black hallway, and sat down in the dark with his revolver resting on his knee. He looked at his pocket watch, the ticking sound cutting through the quiet room like a dripping faucet. Oberstein didn't know his apartment had been discovered. He was still out in the city meeting with his contact to collect his final payment before catching his getaway boat. We sat in total, suffocating darkness for 2 hours, listening to the iron roar of the subway, trains passing by the window every few minutes, shaking the entire apartment building to its roots. My muscle joints were aching, my fingers cramp-locked around the wooden stock of my pistol, my senses pushed to the absolute limit. The waiting became its own kind of torture. I couldn't see Holmes clearly. I could barely see my own hands. Every few seconds, I found myself listening for the smallest change in the apartment. A floorboard, a breath, the movement of cloth, anything. Nothing came. That nothing became unbearable. The darkness seemed to grow heavier with every passing minute. I began imagining shapes where there were none, faint silhouettes forming at the end of the hallway and disappearing whenever I blinked. Once, I thought I saw the outline of a hand resting against the wall. I almost raised my pistol. Then I realized it was only the shadow of a chair. My nerves were becoming unreliable. I kept wondering what would happen if Oberstein entered quietly, saw us first, and decided not to make a sound. The thought was worse than hearing footsteps. It meant he could already be standing somewhere in the apartment while we sat there waiting for him. Every second stretched painfully, and the longer the silence continued, the more convinced I became that something was about to happen. I could feel sweat collecting beneath my collar despite the cold room. My hand tightened around the pistol until the wood began to hurt my palm, but I was afraid to loosen my grip, afraid that the smallest movement might announce our presence. Then I heard a faint creak from somewhere upstairs. I held my breath. Holmes didn't move. The sound came again, then silence. I wondered whether Oberstein had somehow discovered us and was simply waiting outside, listening to us wait for him. The thought made my palms sweat. I could feel my heartbeat pounding against my ribs, so loud that I became convinced the man outside would hear it through the walls. Then, at 11:15 p.m., we heard the faint, metallic scrape of an iron key sliding into the front door lock. My entire body tightened. The heavy front door swung open slowly, letting in a shaft of yellow streetlight from the fog-filled hallway outside. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a heavy fur-lined coat stepped over the threshold, holding a heavy leather Gladstone bag in his left hand. It was Oberstein. He took 2 steps into the dark hallway, stopped dead in his tracks, and sniffed the air, instantly realizing the smell of fresh tobacco smoke wasn't his own. He didn't move. Neither did we. The silence stretched. For one terrible second, I wondered if he could see us. His face remained hidden in the darkness, but I could almost feel his eyes searching the room, moving slowly from corner to corner. Then his head turned slightly toward the darkness where Holmes was sitting. I could hear my own heartbeat. Oberstein's hand slowly disappeared inside his coat. For that single instant, everything seemed frozen. The clock stopped matching, the distant trains seemed to vanish, and even my breathing felt dangerous. I knew that whatever happened next would happen before I had time to think. Before he could pull the trigger on the heavy pistol hidden inside his coat pocket, Holmes moved like a striking viper, lunging out of the darkness and slamming his shoulder straight into the spy's chest, throwing both of them hard against the hallway wall with a deafening crash. The sound exploded through the apartment. For one instant, I froze. The man we had spent hours waiting for was finally there. And now the waiting was over. The nightmare had become physical. The hallway burst into total chaos. Oberstein fought like a cornered beast, throwing wild, brutal punches in the dark, his heavy leather bag crashing against the wooden floorboards. I jumped into the brawl, grabbing Oberstein's right arm just as he pulled a nickel-plated revolver from his coat pocket. He slammed his elbow hard into my jaw, sending bright white sparks flashing across my vision and making me taste copper, but I held onto his wrist with everything I had, twisting his forearm until his iron grip failed and his gun clattered across the floorboards. For a moment, I couldn't see anything clearly. The room spun. I heard Holmes shouting. I heard Oberstein breathing. I heard the revolver scraping across the floor. Every sound seemed separated from reality. The darkness made everything worse. I couldn't tell where Holmes was, where Oberstein was, or how close the gun had stopped. I reached blindly across the floor, terrified that my fingers would touch the cold metal before I could find it. My pulse hammered so violently that I could feel it in my injured jaw. Holmes was relentless. He wrapped his long arm around Oberstein's throat, driving his knee straight into the man's ribs with a sickening crack that echoed through the small corridor. Oberstein let out a strangled gasp, stumbling backward toward the rear kitchen, dragging both of us with him through the dark. The spy reached into his boot, pulled out a wicked 6-inch hunting knife, and slashed blindly behind his back, tearing open the sleeve of my heavy coat and slicing a shallow bloody line across my forearm. I roared in pain. The sudden warmth of blood running down my skin made my stomach twist. For a second, I thought he was going to break free. His strength was terrifying. He fought with the desperation of a man who had already accepted death and simply wanted to make sure someone else died first. His face was only inches away from mine, twisted with rage, and in that moment I saw something in his eyes that frightened me more than the knife. He wasn't afraid. Not of Holmes, not of the gun, not even of dying. He looked like a man who believed there was nothing left in the world worth saving. I grabbed a heavy brass floor lamp off the small table nearby and brought it down hard across the back of Oberstein's head with every ounce of muscle I possessed. The glass shade shattered into 1,000 pieces, showering the room in sharp splinters, and the spy went down hard, his face slamming into the floorboards, completely knocked out cold. Silence returned so suddenly that my ears rang. I stood there staring at the unconscious man. Only moments earlier, he had been moving, fighting, trying to kill us. Now he was completely still. For several seconds, I couldn't make myself approach him. The sight of his motionless body felt wrong after the violence of the struggle. I kept expecting his fingers to twitch, his eyes to open, or his hand to suddenly reach for another weapon hidden beneath his coat. Nothing happened. Holmes immediately dropped to his knees, pinning the unconscious man's wrists behind his back with a pair of steel handcuffs, his breathing heavy and ragged in the dark. He didn't even check to see if I was bleeding. He grabbed the heavy leather Gladstone bag off the floor, ripped open the brass latches, and turned it upside down, dumping its contents out onto the blood-stained rug. Banknotes scattered across the floor. Coins rolled beneath the furniture. Telegraph books landed open. The room looked as though someone had emptied the secrets of half a dozen nations onto the carpet. But I kept looking at Oberstein. There was something deeply disturbing about seeing him unconscious. Because unconscious meant temporary. It meant he could wake up. And if he woke before the handcuffs were secure, we would be back in the darkness fighting for our lives. I stepped farther away from him. Holmes noticed. He said nothing. He simply tightened the cuffs. The metal clicked shut. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the silent apartment. Only then did I finally breathe. Out of the leather bag tumbled thousands of foreign banknotes, gold coins, encrypted telegraph ledger books, and 3 crisp, folded sheets of thick blue tracing paper stamped with the official seal of the Royal Navy Arsenal. The missing Bruce Partington submarine blueprints were lying right there in front of us, completely undamaged and intact. But alongside the stolen plans was a thick stack of personal letters addressed to Colonel Valentine Walter, offering him £5,000 in gold for the final 3 pages of the submarine specs. Holmes picked up the blue tracing paper, inspecting every line and calculation under his matchlight, ensuring not a single detail had been altered or copied. He let out a long, slow breath, the tension finally breaking in his shoulders for the first time in 4 days. I wanted to feel relieved. I couldn't. The room still smelled of blood and gunpowder. Oberstein was lying unconscious only a few feet away. The fog outside pressed against the windows. And somewhere beyond those walls, London continued moving as if nothing had happened. But I knew how close we had come to failure. A single missed clue, a single second of hesitation, a single wrong turn. Any of them could have ended with our bodies lying where Cadogan West had been found. As I was wrapping a white handkerchief around my bleeding forearm, we heard the sound of heavy, desperate footsteps racing up the front apartment stairs. I froze. The footsteps seemed impossibly loud in the narrow building, each one striking the wooden stairs with the force of a warning. They were getting closer. I stared toward the doorway, unable to move. Holmes slowly raised his revolver. For one horrible moment, I wondered whether another man from the spy ring had arrived to finish what Oberstein had started. The footsteps stopped directly outside. Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed. Then the door moved. A man burst through the open front door, gasping for air, his clothes soaked with rain and his face pale with terror. It was Colonel Valentine Walter himself, coming to collect his blood money from Oberstein before fleeing the country. When he saw the international spy lying unconscious on the floor in steel handcuffs, his brother's murderer standing over him, and the stolen blueprints lying in Holmes's hands, the colonel dropped to his knees like a man hit by a cannonball. He buried his face in his trembling hands, sobbing uncontrollably, begging us not to reveal his treason to the newspapers and ruin his family's name forever. Holmes stood over the broken officer, his eyes cold as granite, his voice dripping with absolute disgust as he told the colonel that his brother had already paid the ultimate price for his sins, and that his own pathetic life belonged to the gallows. The colonel looked toward Oberstein, then toward the blueprints, then toward the door. It was obvious that his mind was searching for an escape that no longer existed. I watched his breathing become faster. His fingers trembled. He seemed to understand that every road ahead of him ended badly. And the more Holmes spoke, the more the colonel's face collapsed beneath the weight of what he had done. For the first time, I realized that guilt could look almost like terror. Not the fear of being killed, the fear of having nowhere left to hide. Outside, a train roared through the fog. The windows shook. The colonel flinched violently. Holmes didn't. He simply watched him. The blueprints were recovered. The spy was captured. The traitor was exposed. Yet somehow the room still felt like a place where something terrible had not finished happening. I couldn't explain the feeling, but I kept watching the doorway, expecting another shadow to appear beyond it. The fog seemed to crawl across the glass, hiding the city from view, and for a few seconds I had the strange impression that London itself had gone silent. Nobody moved. Even the colonel seemed afraid to breathe. The only sounds were the faint ticking of the clock, Oberstein's unconscious breathing, and the distant thunder of trains beneath the fog. I looked at the recovered blueprints again. They were supposed to mean the danger was over. Instead, staring at those harmless sheets of blue paper, I felt a cold realization settle inside me. We had recovered the plans, but we had also uncovered exactly how many people were willing to kill for them. Holmes didn't hand the colonel over to the police right away. He grabbed the coward by his collar, hauled him up off his knees, and shoved him hard against the wall, pointing the muzzle of his revolver directly beneath the man's trembling jaw. Colonel Valentine Walter went completely rigid. His eyes locked onto the weapon. I could hear him swallowing. The room was suddenly so quiet that the ticking of Holmes's pocket watch seemed deafening. Every tick felt like another second disappearing, another moment carrying the colonel closer to the end of whatever fate waited for him. I could see the muscles in his throat tightening against the revolver, and for a brief moment I wondered if he was even capable of speaking. Holmes leaned closer and told him that there was one chance to save himself from the gallows. The colonel stared at him without understanding. Holmes explained that Oberstein had not been working alone, and the 3 missing blueprint pages were only one part of a larger exchange. If Valentine wanted any hope of avoiding immediate arrest, he would have to tell Holmes exactly where the remaining members of the spy network were waiting. The colonel's face drained of what little color remained. He began shaking his head. No. Holmes pressed the revolver harder beneath his chin. The colonel closed his eyes. I could see the terror spreading across his face. He knew something Holmes desperately wanted, but he was too frightened to say it. The silence became unbearable. I found myself watching the colonel's eyes, waiting for them to open, wondering what he was seeing behind those closed lids. His entire body trembled against the wall, but he still refused to speak. Then, from the street below, came the distant scream of a train. The colonel opened his eyes. Holmes noticed the reaction. He dragged him toward the window and forced him to look down at the railway tracks disappearing into the fog. Holmes told him that if he refused to cooperate, he would be taken to Scotland Yard immediately. There would be no warning, no opportunity to destroy evidence, no chance to protect the family name he had already sacrificed. The colonel stared at the tracks. His breathing became shallow. For several seconds, he seemed unable to speak. I watched him staring into the fog and wondered what exactly he feared seeing down there. The railway looked empty, but the darkness between the rails seemed deep enough to hide anything. The colonel's expression suggested that he wasn't looking at an empty track at all. Then he finally whispered the location of the next meeting. Holmes released his collar. The colonel almost collapsed. I thought the danger was finally over. I was wrong. Holmes turned toward the window and stared into the fog. He had already understood something the rest of us had missed. The colonel hadn't been afraid of the police. He had been afraid of someone else. Someone who was still free. Someone who knew exactly what Valentine had done. That realization settled over the room like another layer of darkness. I suddenly became aware that the windows were still uncovered. The door was still open, and we had no idea who might be watching the building from the street below. Holmes quietly folded the blueprints and placed them inside his coat. Then he looked at me. We are not finished. Outside, the railway lights appeared through the fog. One, then another. The train approached slowly, its iron wheels screaming against the rails. The colonel watched it with a terrified expression. Holmes watched the colonel, and I watched both of them. For the first time, I understood the real purpose of the entire investigation. The murderer had used the railway as a weapon. Now Holmes intended to use it as bait. And somewhere beyond the fog, someone was waiting for the next train. I felt a cold pressure settle in my chest as I stared at those approaching lights. We had spent hours hunting men who hid in darkness, yet now Holmes was deliberately drawing another one toward us. The train grew louder. The building trembled. The colonel's hands began shaking again. And somewhere beyond the fog, hidden among the noise and shadows of London, the person we had been searching for was already waiting.